Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. You know, we love to dig into the stuff you send our way, and today we're tackling something pretty big, prison reform in the U.S.
Yeah, definitely a hot topic.
Yeah, and we're looking at this relationship literacy manual for reforming the U.S. prison system that one of our listeners sent in.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's advocating for something called relationship literacy programs, or RLP. And it really caught my eye because it's not just about changing inmates' behavior.
Right.
It's about giving them a whole new set of skills for navigating life, both inside and outside of prison.
Exactly. It's a really different approach than what we usually see. The whole lock them up and throw away the key mentality.
Yeah.
RLP focuses on teaching inmates the basics of healthy relationships, like emotional intelligence, communication, conflict resolution, things that a lot of us take for granted.
Okay, I gotta be honest, that sounds almost too good to be true. Like teaching emotional intelligence in a prison environment. I mean, how can you even begin to cultivate empathy and communication skills in a place that's often defined by aggression and distrust?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge, but that's where the innovation of RLP comes in.
Okay.
One of the core principles is that it has to be a holistic approach. You can't just teach inmates these skills in a vacuum.
Right.
You got to create a culture shift within the entire prison environment.
So it's not just about changing the inmates, it's about changing the system itself.
Exactly. It involves redefining the roles of staff, promoting empathy, and building trust through communication. It even goes beyond the prison walls, getting communities involved in the rehabilitation process.
Okay, that makes sense. But I'm also really curious about the historical context here because the manual actually starts off with this overview of early American prisons.
Oh, yeah.
And honestly, I was pretty shocked to learn how different they were from what we have today.
Oh, absolutely. It's a huge contrast. Early American prisons, going back to the colonial era, they were more about public humiliation and physical punishment.
Wow.
Think about stocks, pillories, public whippings. Those were the tools of the trade back then, not exactly a recipe for rehabilitation.
No, not at all. So when did the shift towards penitentiaries and this idea of rehabilitation actually start to happen?
Well, the late 1700s saw the rise of the penitentiary.
Okay.
And a lot of that was influenced by, Enlightenment thinkers who were advocating for a more humane approach to punishment.
I see.
The goal shifted towards reforming criminals through isolation and reflection.
Okay.
And the Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia, which was established in 1790, is often considered the first American penitentiary.
Okay, so instead of public shaming, it became about isolating individuals to encourage self-reflection and repentance.
Yeah, kind of, but you bring up a good point.
Yeah.
That seems like it could easily backfire and, lead to even more psychological damage.
Exactly.
And that's where the debate over the best approach to rehabilitation really began. You had the Pennsylvania system, which was all about complete solitary confinement.
Yeah.
And then you had the Auburn system, which allowed inmates to work together during the day, but enforced silence at all times.
So two very different philosophies right from the start.
Yeah.
But honestly, neither sounds ideal. Did these early models influence the prisons we have today?
They definitely laid the groundwork for the large state-run prisons that became common throughout the 19th century.
Okay.
And as America industrialized and expanded westward, the prison population exploded, and unfortunately that focus on rehabilitation started to fade.
And I'm guessing this is where we see the beginnings of mass incarceration and the prison industrial complex.
You got it. The 20th century saw a shift towards a much more punitive approach. And that was fueled by things like the war on drugs, mandatory minimum sentencing laws, and this growing connection between prisons and private corporations.
Right, the prison industrial complex. And actually our listener specifically mentioned being interested in understanding the differences between public and private prisons. So can you kind of unpack that for us?
Of course. So it all comes down to, who's paying the bills and what their goals are.
Okay.
Public prisons are run by the government and funded by taxpayers.
Right.
While private prisons are operated by for-profit companies that have contracts with the government.
Okay, so that profit motive, that's where things get a little murky.
Yeah, it can definitely get complicated. So how do you think that profit motive might affect the way private prisons operate?
Well, I imagine there's a lot of pressure to keep those prisons full in order to maximize profits.
That's a big one.
Yeah, so that could lead to lobbying for harsher sentencing laws and, maybe even cutting corners when it comes to things like staffing healthcare and, most importantly, rehabilitation programs.
It's definitely a major criticism of the private prison system and a key factor driving the call for, reforms like RLP.
It's a chilling thought that the incentive to profit could actually work against the goal of rehabilitation.
Yeah, it's a big problem.
And potentially even make that cycle of incarceration worse.
Right.
Okay, so we've got this historical backdrop, right?
Yeah.
Punishment evolving into attempts at rehabilitation.
Right.
And then that getting twisted by this profit-driven system.
Right.
And now that brings us to RLP, which is trying to get back to the core of what rehabilitation should be.
Exactly. And one of the most interesting things about RLP is that it challenges the core of what's broken in our current system.
Yeah.
We talk about reintegration.
Right.
But do we really equip people with the skills to actually rebuild their lives and form healthy relationships after they get out?
You're right. It's like we expect people to just magically transform once they leave prison.
Yeah.
But without the right tools, we're setting them up to fail.
Exactly. And that's precisely where RLP comes in.
Okay.
It gives inmates the tools they need to not just survive, but actually thrive. Imagine the impact of having emotional intelligence, conflict resolution skills, strong communication.
Yeah.
These are essential for any relationship, whether it's family, friends, or even in the workplace.
So essentially, RLP is giving inmates a toolkit for life after prison,
Yeah,
helping them break free from those destructive cycles that often lead right back to incarceration.
right.
But you mentioned earlier that this program is unique because it's holistic
Yeah.
and addresses the entire prison environment. So what does that actually look like in practice?
Well, it's multifaceted.
Okay.
For starters, it requires a shift in the mindset of the prison staff. Many might see RLP as, soft on inmates, or doubt its effectiveness in addressing things like violence and security.
Right.
So the manual really emphasizes the need for strong staff training to help them understand the benefits of RLP and to see how it can make their jobs easier and safer in the long run.
So it's not about going easy on inmates. It's about creating a more stable and rehabilitative environment for everyone.
Exactly. The idea is that a prison where inmates have these skills
Yeah.
is likely to be a less volatile place overall.
Right. But staff buy-in is only one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
What about resources?
Yeah, that's another big hurdle.
Because prisons, especially public ones, are often really underfunded.
Right.
So how do you secure the funding to implement a program like RLP?
It's a tough question.
Yeah.
And there's no easy answer.
Okay, but let's not forget the most important participants in all of this, the inmates themselves.
Right, of course.
How do you get individuals who might be, steeped in a culture of violence and distrust
Yeah.
to buy into a program that's all about vulnerability and communication?
You've hit on the most critical element, building trust. RLP facilitators need to create a safe space where inmates feel comfortable opening up and sharing their experiences without fear of judgment or reprisal.
That makes a lot of sense. And if you can establish that foundation of trust, I can only imagine the positive ripple effects it could have.
The potential is huge. As inmates start to understand the value of RLP and experience those tangible benefits, like stronger relationships and improved communication, they can actually become the program's biggest advocates.
Okay, so we've established that building trust is crucial,
Definitely.
but we've only scratched the surface of what RLP actually entails.
Right.
So let's dive into the specifics of how this program equips inmates with these essential life skills.
Sounds good. But before we get into the nuts and bolts of the program itself,
Okay.
I think it's important to understand how RLP is tailored to the specific needs of different groups of inmates.
That's a good point, because a one-size-fits-all approach isn't going to work in this context.
No, not at all.
And speaking of different groups, let's start with one of the most significant distinctions to gender,
Okay.
because the manual highlights the unique challenges faced by men and women in prison and how RLP needs to be adapted to address those differences. So maybe you could break that down for us.
Sure. So when it comes to men, RLP often starts by challenging those deeply ingrained notions of masculinity. Many men enter prison with a very limited emotional vocabulary. They've been conditioned to suppress their feelings, to equate vulnerability with weakness, and to just default to aggression or stoicism as coping mechanisms.
It's a really powerful observation, and I can see how those ingrained patterns could be major roadblocks to personal growth and healthy relationships, both inside and outside of prison.
Exactly. So RLP works to help men develop emotional intelligence. It's about teaching them to identify and express their emotions in healthy ways.
Okay.
To challenge those harmful stereotypes of masculinity and embrace a more balanced and authentic way of being.
So instead of resorting to anger or shutting down completely, they learn to actually process and communicate their emotions in a constructive way.
That's the goal. It's about equipping them with the tools to navigate their inner world and build healthier relationships with others.
That's incredibly important work. But what about the women? What are some of the unique challenges they face? And how does RLP address those?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, women in prison often carry a heavy burden of trauma, often stemming from, abuse or violence. So RLP provides a safe and supportive environment for them to process that trauma and begin to heal.
That sounds incredibly valuable, especially considering that many of these women may have never had the opportunity to address their trauma before.
That's right, and it goes beyond just talking about the past.
Right.
RLP also teaches women coping mechanisms for managing things like stress, anxiety, and other mental health challenges they might be facing.
So it's about giving them the tools to take care of their emotional and mental well-being.
Exactly, because when you're struggling with those internal battles, it's really hard to focus on anything else.
Yeah, let alone rehabilitation.
Right.
But the manual also talks about the importance of something that might seem less obvious at first glance, building self-esteem.
Oh yeah, self-esteem is absolutely crucial. Many women enter prison feeling broken and worthless, often due to, years of abuse or neglect.
Right.
So RLP helps them recognize their own strengths and inherent value. See themselves as worthy of love and respect.
It's like rebuilding their sense of self from the ground up.
Exactly, and when women start to believe in themselves, it can shift their whole perspective. They're more likely to make positive choices, set goals, and believe they can achieve them.
Now, one challenge that's unique to women in prison that we haven't talked about yet is motherhood.
Right.
How does RLP support mothers who are separated from their children?
That's a huge issue, and the pain of that separation can be devastating for both the mothers and the kids.
Yeah.
So RLP offers support in several ways, but it starts with helping mothers stay connected with their children, whether it's through letters, phone calls, or visits.
I imagine those connections must be a lifeline for both the mother and the children.
They really are.
But it's not just about maintaining contact, right? There are also the practical challenges of being a parent from prison.
Absolutely. That's where RLP provides guidance on, parenting from prison.
Okay.
Helping mothers stay involved in their children's lives, even from a distance. This could involve things like teaching them how to communicate effectively with their kids, how to handle discipline issues, or just, how to offer emotional support.
So it's about equipping them with the tools to navigate parenthood, even within the confines of prison.
Exactly. It's about giving them hope and a sense of agency.
And helping them prepare for reunification with their children after release.
Right.
Okay, so we've talked about how RLP can be tailored to the specific needs of men and women in prison.
Yeah.
But the manual really emphasizes that individual transformation is only part of the equation.
Right.
There's a broader goal of creating a more relationship-literate culture within the entire prison environment. So what does that kind of cultural shift actually entail?
It's about cultivating a culture that prioritizes open and honest communication, both among inmates and between inmates and staff. Okay. It's about fostering empathy and respect, even in the face of conflict, and recognizing that shared humanity that connects us all.
That's a powerful vision. But it sounds like a really tall order for an environment that's, traditionally been all about control and punishment.
It is. It's a big challenge.
So how do you even begin to cultivate those values in a place like that?
It starts with leadership.
Okay.
Prison leaders need to not only endorse RLP, but also embody its principles in their own actions.
Right.
It's about creating a culture that genuinely supports these values.
So leading by example, showing that a different way of interacting is possible even within that rigid structure of a prison.
Exactly. And it's about empowering staff to embrace these values as well.
Okay.
They need training in the principles of relationship literacy and support in implementing those principles in their daily interactions with inmates.
The manual mentions the importance of creating safe spaces for emotional expression within a prison.
Yeah, that's crucial.
Can you elaborate on what that looks like and why it's so important?
Of course. So inmates need to feel safe to talk about their feelings, process their experiences without fear of judgment or ridicule.
Yeah.
This could involve things like setting up support groups, offering counseling services, or even just encouraging inmates to talk to each other, to staff, about what they're going through.
So it's about fostering a sense of community, a place where people feel heard and understood,
Right.
which can be a really powerful antidote to that isolation and dehumanization that we often see in prisons.
Exactly. And when you create that kind of environment, it's amazing how much healing and transformation can take place.
It sounds like you're describing a very different kind of prison than what most people imagine.
That's the goal of RLP, to shift the focus from punishment to rehabilitation, to recognize that even within a prison, people can grow and develop the skills they need to build a better life.
Okay, so we've talked about the importance of staff buy-in,
Yeah.
the challenges of securing resources, the need to build trust with inmates,
Right.
and the power of creating that safe and supportive environment.
Yeah.
We've even explored how RLP is tailored to meet the needs of men and women, but we've only scratched the surface. We need to delve deeper into the nuts and bolts of how these programs are actually structured and implemented.
Yeah, let's do that next.
And that's exactly what we're going to do when we come back for part 2 of this deep dive.
You know, one of the things that I find so interesting about RLP is that it goes beyond just changing behavior.
Okay.
It really focuses on changing the way people think and relate to themselves and others.
Yeah, when we left off, we were talking about creating that, relationship literate culture within the prison.
Right.
But now I'm kind of curious about what RLP looks like on a more individual level. Like,
Yeah.
what are the actual techniques and practices that are used to teach things like emotional intelligence and conflict resolution?
Well, one of the key principles of RLP is that it's not a one-size-fits-all program.
Okay.
It's really adapted to the specific needs of the inmates and the particular prison environment.
So it's not like there's a, pre-packaged curriculum that you just roll out in every single prison.
Right, exactly. It requires a lot of flexibility and customization.
Can you give us some specific examples of how RLP might be adapted for different groups of inmates?
Sure. So let's say you're working with a group of inmates who have a history of violent offenses.
Okay.
In that case, the program might focus heavily on anger management and de-escalation techniques.
Okay.
They might use role-playing exercises to practice identifying your triggers
Right.
and developing strategies for responding nonviolently.
So it's about giving them practical tools to manage those really intense emotions.
Exactly.
What about inmates who are struggling with addiction?
Well, RLP can actually be integrated into substance abuse treatment programs.
Okay.
Helping inmates understand those underlying emotional and relational issues that might be driving their addiction.
Right, because it's not just about breaking that physical addiction, it's about addressing those deeper needs that might be fueling that behavior.
Exactly. And for inmates who are, nearing release, RLP can shift its focus to preparing them for that reintegration into their families and communities. This might involve things like communication skills, training, job interview practice, and even guidance on parenting from prison.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It's like you're giving them a roadmap for navigating all those challenges of life after prison.
Right.
But how do you know if RLP is actually working? Like, how do you measure something as intangible as relationship literacy?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's not as straightforward as measuring something like recidivism rates.
Right.
But there are ways to kind of assess the impact of RLP on a more nuanced level.
Okay, so what are some of those ways? How do you actually measure those subtle shifts in behavior and attitude?
Well, you can start by looking for changes in inmate behavior within the prison itself.
Okay.
Are they resolving conflicts more peacefully? Are they communicating more effectively with staff and other inmates?
Right.
Are there fewer incidents of violence or aggression?
So you're looking for those skills actually being put into practice in their daily interactions.
Exactly. It's a much more direct measure than just relying on recidivism rates.
Yeah.
You can also use surveys and interviews to kind of gauge inmates' perceptions of their own relationship skills. Ask them questions like, do you feel more equipped to handle conflict now? Or has this program changed the way you communicate with your family?
It's about getting that subjective feedback.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
On how the program has impacted their thinking and their behavior.
Exactly.
But it's not just about the inmates, is it? You also mentioned getting feedback from staff.
Oh, absolutely. Staff are really on the front lines, so their observations are incredibly valuable.
Okay.
You can ask them things like, have you noticed a difference in the overall atmosphere of the prison since RLP was implemented? Or do you feel like inmates are more respectful and responsive now?
So it's about getting that 360-degree view of the program's impact, gathering data from all those different perspectives.
Right.
But what about the bigger picture? How does RLP address those systemic issues that we talked about earlier, like the influence of the prison industrial complex?
Yeah, well, that's where the focus really shifts to advocacy and policy change.
RLP advocates are working to, raise awareness about the flaws in our current system.
Yeah.
And push for reforms that really prioritize rehabilitation over punishment.
So it's about tackling those bigger issues on a legislative level, trying to create a system that's more aligned with the principles of RLP.
Exactly, and it's a multi-pronged approach.
Okay.
It involves things like, lobbying for sentencing reform, pushing for increased funding for rehabilitation programs, and advocating for alternatives to incarceration for non-violent offenders.
It sounds like a pretty daunting task, but also a really necessary one.
It is. It's a long game.
Yeah.
But I think there's a growing recognition that the status quo just isn't working. The human and financial costs of mass incarceration are just way too high, and RLP really offers a compelling alternative.
And it's not just about changing laws, it's about changing hearts and minds.
That's a good point.
We need to shift our collective understanding of what justice really means.
That's right, and that's where community involvement becomes so important.
Okay. RLP advocates are working to engage communities in the reintegration process. Helping them understand the challenges that former inmates face and encouraging them to offer support.
That's a crucial piece of the puzzle, right?
Yes.
It's about breaking down that stigma associated with incarceration.
Yeah.
And recognizing that everyone deserves a second chance.
Absolutely. And it's also about understanding that supporting former inmates benefits not just them, but the entire community. When people are given that opportunity to rebuild their lives, they're less likely to reoffend, which makes everyone safer.
So it's a win-win situation.
Yeah.
But how can communities actually get involved in a practical way?
Right.
What are some tangible things that they can do to support RLP and inmate reintegration?
Well, there are a lot of ways to contribute.
Okay.
Some communities have set up job training programs specifically for former inmates, helping them acquire the skills they need to find employment. Others have created mentorship programs pairing former inmates with individuals who can offer guidance and support as they transition back into society.
Those are great examples of, targeted support.
Yeah.
But what about something more grassroots? How can individuals get involved even if they don't have specialized skills or resources to offer?
Well, sometimes the simplest acts of kindness can have the biggest impact. Something as basic as, offering a friendly greeting or a listening ear can go a long way in helping a former inmate feel welcomed and accepted.
It's about treating them with dignity and respect, recognizing their humanity instead of defining them by their past mistakes.
Exactly. And that kind of shift in attitude can be contagious.
Yeah.
When individuals start to change the way they interact with former inmates, it can really ripple outward, creating a more compassionate and inclusive community as a whole.
Now, you mentioned earlier that leadership plays a crucial role in the success of RLP.
Yeah.
And not just within the prison itself, but also on a broader societal level.
Right. Leadership is absolutely essential for driving that systemic change. We need leaders who are willing to challenge the status quo and advocate for policies that prioritize rehabilitation over retribution. And we need leaders who are willing to invest in programs like RLP that have the potential to transform lives.
But leadership isn't just about, those in positions of power, is it?
No, not at all.
It can also come from everyday citizens who are passionate about making a difference.
Absolutely. Everyone has the capacity to be a leader in their own way. It might involve volunteering at a local reentry program, writing to your elected officials about criminal justice reform, or just speaking up when you hear someone, making disparaging remarks about former inmates.
It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable society.
And it's about understanding that change doesn't happen overnight. It requires a sustained effort, a willingness to challenge our own biases, and a commitment to working together to create a better future for everyone.
I think that's a really powerful message to leave our listeners with.
I hope so.
But before we wrap up, I'm curious about the long-term vision for RLP. Like, what do advocates ultimately hope to achieve?
Well, the ultimate goal is to create a criminal justice system that is truly restorative. One that focuses on healing, rehabilitation, and reintegration. A system that recognizes the humanity of all individuals, regardless of their past mistakes. And provides them with the support they need to build a better future.
That's a beautiful vision, and I think it really speaks to the heart of what RLP is all about. Recognizing our shared humanity and working together to create a more compassionate and just world.
I agree.
But what about the more immediate future? Like, what are some of the specific policy changes that RLP advocates are actually working towards?
Well, one of the key priorities is sentencing reform. Advocates are pushing for alternatives to incarceration for non-violent offenders, as well as for shorter sentences for those who have committed more serious crimes.
That makes sense because it seems like our current sentencing guidelines are often overly punitive.
Yeah.
And they don't really take into account the individual circumstances of each case.
Right, and there's a growing body of evidence suggesting that long prison sentences don't necessarily deter crime and can actually increase the likelihood of recidivism.
So it's not just about being tough on crime, it's about being smart on crime.
Exactly, and that's where programs like RLP come in.
Right.
By investing in rehabilitation, we can break that cycle of incarceration and create a safer and more just society for everyone.
Another area where RLP advocates are pushing for change is in the way that we treat mental health and addiction within the criminal justice system.
Absolutely. Far too often, individuals with mental health or substance abuse issues end up in prison instead of receiving the treatment that they need. So RLP advocates are pushing for increased funding for mental health and addiction services, both within prisons and in the community.
That makes a lot of sense because it seems counterproductive to incarcerate people who are struggling with these issues.
Yeah.
When what they really need is access to treatment and support.
Exactly. And it's not just about being compassionate, it's also about being practical.
Right.
Treating mental health and addiction is much more cost-effective than incarceration.
Yeah.
And it leads to better outcomes for individuals and communities.
So it's a win-win from both a humanitarian and a fiscal perspective.
Exactly.
What are some other policy changes that RLP advocates are working towards?
Well, another key area of focus is ending the use of solitary confinement.
Oh yeah, solitary confinement has been widely criticized as being cruel and inhumane.
It is, and there's mounting evidence that it can have really devastating psychological effects.
Right. It's often used as a punishment, but it seems like it's actually counterproductive to the goals of rehabilitation.
Exactly. Solitary confinement isolates individuals. It exacerbates mental health issues.
Yeah.
And it makes it much more difficult for them to reintegrate into society upon release.
It seems like we really need to move away from these kind of punitive approaches and focus on creating a system that is, more rehabilitative and restorative.
That's the ultimate goal of RLP, to create a criminal justice system that is rooted in empathy, compassion, and a belief in the potential for human transformation.
But I think that's a vision worth fighting for.
I agree.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into RLP.
We have.
We've explored, the theory behind the program, the challenges of implementation, the impact it's having on individuals and communities, and the broader policy changes that advocates are pushing for. But you mentioned earlier that there's one crucial element that we haven't talked about yet.
Oh, yeah.
Staff training.
You're right. Staff training is absolutely essential for the success of RLP.
Okay.
It's not enough to just implement the program.
Right.
You need to equip staff with the knowledge, skills, and support they need to implement it effectively.
So what does that training actually involve? Like, what are some of the key things that staff need to learn in order to embrace those principles of RLP and create that relationship literate culture within the prison?
Well, the training covers a wide range of topics.
Okay.
From the basics of emotional intelligence and communication skills to things like conflict resolution and de-escalation techniques.
Right.
It also emphasizes the importance of empathy, active listening, and building trust with inmates.
It sounds like a pretty intensive program.
It is.
But I imagine it's really crucial for staff to internalize these concepts if RLP is going to be successful.
It's not just about teaching them a set of techniques.
Right.
It's about helping them shift their mindset and see inmates as individuals worthy of respect and compassion.
Yeah, that's a powerful point. And I imagine it's not always easy for staff
No.
who are used to a more traditional authoritarian approach to suddenly embrace this more empathetic and collaborative style.
You're right. It can be a challenging transition for some staff members.
So what does that support look like in practice?
Well, it could involve things like, regular check-ins with supervisors, peer support groups, and access to mental health professionals who can help them process the emotional challenges of working in a prison environment.
It sounds like it's just as important to support the staff as it is to support the inmates.
Absolutely. the staff are the ones who are implementing RLP on a daily basis. So
Yeah.
their well-being is crucial to the success of the program.
But it's not just about supporting individual staff members, is it?
Right.
It's also about creating a culture of support within the entire prison environment.
Exactly. It's about creating a workplace where staff feel valued, respected, and empowered to do their best work.
Now, you mentioned earlier that RLP can be adapted for different groups of inmates.
Yeah.
And we talked about the unique challenges faced by men and women in prison.
Right.
But I'm curious about how RLP addresses the needs of, specific populations within those groups.
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the strengths of RLP is that it can be tailored to address the needs of various subpopulations within the prison.
Okay.
For example, there are RLP programs specifically designed for young offenders,
Okay.
for LGBTQ inmates, and for those with mental health issues.
It sounds like it requires a deep understanding of the specific challenges faced by each group.
It does, and it requires a willingness to be flexible
Right.
and adapt the program to meet those needs.
Can you give us some examples of how RLP might be adapted for those specific populations?
Sure, so for young offenders, RLP might focus on developing impulse control,
Okay.
decision-making skills, and healthy peer relationships. It might also involve working with their families to address any underlying issues that may have contributed to their criminal behavior.
So it's about recognizing that young people are still developing
Yeah.
and that they need, guidance and support to make those positive choices.
Exactly, and for LGBTQ inmates, RLP might focus on creating a safe and supportive environment where they can be themselves without fear of harassment or discrimination.
Okay.
It might also involve addressing issues of self-esteem, identity, and coming out.
It's about creating a space where they feel seen, heard, and respected for who they are.
Right, and for inmates with mental health issues, RLP might be integrated with mental health treatment
Yep.
to help them develop coping mechanisms, manage their symptoms, and build healthy relationships.
It sounds like a very holistic and individualized approach.
It is, and it's about recognizing that every inmate is an individual with their own unique needs and challenges.
One of the things that strikes me about RLP is that it's not just about reducing recidivism.
Right.
It's about something much deeper. It's about personal transformation,
Yeah,
about helping people reconnect with their humanity and find their purpose in life.
you've hit the nail on the head. It's about empowering individuals to create a better future for themselves and their communities.
And that's a powerful message that I think resonates with everyone,
Yeah.
regardless of their background or beliefs.
I agree, it's a message of hope, healing, and the possibility of redemption.
And on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this part of our deep dive into RLP. Okay, so we've been unpacking this relationship literacy manual, and it's been really fascinating to see how RLP is trying to change the way we think about prison and rehabilitation.
Yeah, it's definitely a paradigm shift.
So we just finished talking about the importance of staff training and how this program can be adapted for different groups of inmates, but it's clear that RLP is aiming for a much broader impact.
Right, it's not just about working within the existing system, it's about transforming the system itself.
You mentioned earlier that one of the ways they're doing that is by advocating for policy changes.
Yeah.
What are some of the specific policy reforms that RLP advocates are fighting for?
Well, one of the key priorities is sentencing reform.
Okay.
They're advocating for shorter sentences, especially for nonviolent offense, and alternatives to incarceration whenever possible.
Right.
The idea is that locking people up for long periods of time doesn't necessarily make us safer,
Yeah,
and it can actually increase the likelihood of them reoffending.
that makes sense. It seems like our current sentencing guidelines are often overly harsh.
Yeah.
They don't really take into account the individual circumstances of each case.
Right, and there's a growing body of evidence that supports that.
Okay, but what about those who do need to be incarcerated?
Yeah.
How does RLP envision a more rehabilitative approach within prisons?
Well, they're pushing for increased funding for rehabilitation programs within prisons.
Okay.
They want to see more programs like RLP that teach inmates valuable life skills, help them address their underlying issues,
Right.
and prepare them for successful reintegration into society.
So it's not just about warehousing people.
No?
It's about giving them the tools and support they need to actually turn their lives around.
Exactly, and that includes addressing the root causes of criminal behavior, such as poverty, lack of education, and mental health issues.
Now, we talked earlier about the importance of community involvement in supporting RLP.
Yeah, that's a huge part of it.
So how do advocates see communities playing a role in this broader effort to create a more, rehabilitative justice system?
Well, communities can play a vital role in supporting former inmates as they reintegrate into society. This could involve things like offering job training and placement programs, providing affordable housing, and creating mentorship opportunities.
It sounds like it really takes a whole village to truly support someone who's trying to rebuild their life after incarceration.
It does, and it requires a shift in our collective mindset. We need to move away from the idea that former inmates are somehow other.
Yeah.
And recognize that they are members of our community who deserve a second chance.
It's about breaking down those barriers of fear and judgment.
Right.
And extending a hand of compassion and support.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that everyone benefits. When we invest in rehabilitation and create a system that helps people turn their lives around.
Now, I know that RLP has been around for a while.
Yeah.
But it seems like it's gaining more traction in recent years. So what do you think is driving this renewed interest in the program?
Well, I think there are a few factors at play.
Okay.
First, there's a growing recognition that our current criminal justice system is just broken. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world.
Yeah, it's a pretty staggering statistic.
It is, and yet we're not any safer than other developed countries that have much lower incarceration rates.
So it seems like we're spending a lot of money and locking a lot of people up.
Yeah.
But it's not actually making us any safer.
That's the bottom line, and I think people are starting to realize that there's a better way. RLP offers a more humane and effective approach, one that focuses on rehabilitation and redemption, rather than punishment and retribution.
And it's not about being soft on crime. It's about being smart on crime. Investing in rehabilitation is really an investment in our communities, in our collective well-being.
And there's growing evidence to support that.
Okay.
Studies have shown that RLP can significantly reduce recidivism rates and improve the lives of both former inmates and their families.
So it's not just a feel-good program, it actually produces tangible results.
Exactly. And I think that's why we're seeing more and more policymakers, law enforcement officials, and community leaders embracing RLP as a viable solution to our criminal justice crisis.
So from your perspective, what are some of the biggest challenges facing the RLP movement? What are the obstacles that advocates are still trying to overcome?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is funding.
Okay.
Rehabilitation programs like RLP are often underfunded, which limits their reach and their impact.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's hard to implement any kind of meaningful change without adequate resources.
Absolutely. And another challenge is overcoming the stigma associated with incarceration. Former inmates often face discrimination when it comes to things like employment, housing, and education.
It's like they've served their time,
right,
but they're still being punished long after they've been released.
Exactly. And that can make it incredibly difficult for them to rebuild their lives and become productive members of society.
So we need to create a culture that's more forgiving and supportive of former inmates.
Absolutely.
It seems like the work of RLP advocates is really about changing hearts and minds, as much as it's about changing laws and policies.
You're right. It's about challenging our assumptions about crime and punishment and recognizing the humanity of all individuals, regardless of their past mistakes.
And it's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in creating a more just and compassionate society.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we all have a stake in creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into RLP.
We have. It's been great.
We've explored the history of the program, the principles behind it, the challenges it faces, and the incredible potential it holds for transforming lives and communities.
It's been a fascinating conversation.
It really has.
And I hope our listeners have gained a deeper understanding of this, innovative approach to criminal justice reform.
I think they have. And I hope they've also been inspired to think about how they can get involved in this important movement.
Yeah, me too.
Whether it's volunteering at a local reentry program, contacting their elected officials about criminal justice reform, or simply having more compassionate conversations about these issues. Every action, no matter how small, can make a difference.
You're absolutely right. Change starts with each of us. And by working together, we can create a world where justice is truly restorative and where everyone has the opportunity to reach their full potential.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into RLP.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been an enlightening conversation, and I'm sure our listeners will be pondering these ideas long after this episode ends. So
I hope so.
Until next time, keep diving deep.